I had a chance, I thought, to write about this person I knew. So many people seem to be seeing not a life, but a headline. And perhaps I could introduce them to this man, and then they could decide what they thought about him.
Tony Hiss, the son of accused communist spy Alger Hiss. Today on Now I've Heard Everything, I'm Bill Thompson. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, America was caught up in a Red Scare. The fear of communism, communist spies, communist infiltration. And among those accused was a State Department official who had also actually helped form the United Nations, named Alger Hiss. He was accused by a man named Whittaker Chambers of spying for the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Now, by the time he was accused in 1948, the statute of limitations on espionage had expired, but Hiss was then charged with perjury for lying about his alleged communist involvement. And one of those who was making a name for himself by prosecuting Alger Hiss was a young California congressman named Richard M. Nixon. And in fact, the Hiss case helped propel Nixon to national prominence. Now, it was this week, 75 years ago, January 1950, that Alger Hiss was convicted of perjury and sentenced to prison. Now, at the time, his son Tony was not even a teenager yet. But in the 4 years or so that Alger Hiss was in prison, their relationship changed rather dramatically and for the better, as Tony Hiss wrote about in a 1999 book that he called The View from Alger's Window. That's when I had the chance to speak with him. So in just a moment, my conversation with Tony Hiss.
Have you ever opened a time capsule? You're about to. This interview is from national radio personality Bill Thompson's 30-year interview archive. Enjoy.
So here now from 1999, Tony Hiss.
After my father died, I was busy writing a book about transportation, and it seemed to me that I'd spent a lot of time with my father's encouragement at trying to create a life where I was not just the son of someone, but had a lot of interests that I thought I'd discovered on my own, and it seemed time to get on with my life, and yet, as the months went by, it was clear that he was not being allowed to get on with his death, even though there were plenty of younger people who didn't even sort of know who he was. I remember Stutz Terkel once did a street interview. Who was Alger Hiss? And, wasn't he that black ball player that got in trouble with the government? And, oh yeah, the Nazi spy. And I've talked to people in their 20s who say, Alger Hiss, neat name, or is that an anagram?
Oh, gee.
Nevertheless, there were more and more books coming out that seemed to be trying to convict him all over again. Well, I've never set myself up as a student of the Hiss case or a Cold War researcher, but it occurred to me that maybe I was in a position to do something that nobody else had ever done, because all the ironies of fate, really got to know my dad best when he was in jail. For the first time in his life, my world-traveling father, in a funny kind of way, I had him all to myself because he had to stay in one place. And also, in the second irony, this, of all places, was the spot where he sort of opened up, and the great warmth in him came outside. His public persona had always been a bit stuffy and chilly, even, and very wasp-like.
It was almost like a near-death experience.
In many ways, I think that's very true. But it was also that his attitude, I think. Maybe the thing I admire about him most was not just that he was meeting adversity with courage or dignity, but that he saw it as an opportunity to look deeper and to learn about a side of life that had never exposed itself to him. And it's why probably in later years he'd like to say that 3 years in jail is a good corrective to 3 years at Harvard.
I've heard that, and I think
really admire him for saying it. But it was true. At least he used it that way. It was probably the place where he learned how to listen to people better than he ever had, to hear what they were saying, what they weren't saying, as well as what they were saying. where he started acting as sort of a mentor and teacher to young people, and something that he then continued to do the rest of his life, because he really, when he got out, barely half his life was over. And I've met hundreds of people, now middle-aged, who say, your father, when I was in high school or college, he was the first grown-up that ever took me seriously, that listened to me carefully, and I would come back 6 months later, and he would remember what I'd said. No one had ever done that. And I know a college president who said, when I got out of school, I had no idea where my life was going, and I spent the better part of 3 days talking to your father, and suddenly my course was set. So I had a chance, I thought, to write about this person I knew. So many people seem to be seeing not a life, but a headline, and perhaps I could introduce them to this man, and then they could decide what they thought about him.
Even less than a headline, in some cases, just an icon, just
Yes.
an image.
Yes.
A buzzword, as it were.
Yes, and I realized that the image is sort of a larger-than-life, but at the same time smaller-than-life kind of thing that sort of drifts into the brain almost as a placeholder when you don't really know a real person. You just sort of occupy that space with something for the time being.
But I found it chilling to think that, as you report in your book, that even when was Anthony Lake in his confirmation hearings a couple of years ago ran into trouble because somebody on the committee felt that he had heard that Lake still wasn't sure that Alger Hiss was guilty.
That's right.
It's just what a powerful, if it is an icon, a buzzword, a headline, it still retains a heck of a lot of power.
For many people, it is still a current event. And the fact that he could be called unfit to hold high office because he had expressed doubts about Alger Hiss's guilt is astonishing. It's 50 years later. And yet, rather than just being the trial of the century, for some people it seems to have become the never-ending story and the trial that consumed the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah, we should come back to what you were saying at the outset just a moment ago when we started. This is not a political book. This is not a reopening, re-examination of the Hiss case.
Not at all. This is not a political. It tries to be a personal and not a political book. I realized I was not in a position to write another book about the Hiss case, and that maybe the best thing I could do was not to write an argumentative book at all. And in the words of an old fairy story, close the shop of argument and mystery and open the tea house of experience. So I would just present the man I got to know. I was very fortunate in very unfortunate circumstances, both to get to know him and also to to see deeply inside him. I both in the monthly visits we'd have and in these extraordinary letters he was writing home, 3 a week for 44 months. Which my mother treasured and kept in a box all these years. They are a window into a soul.
It is astounding to think 2 hours a month. Just 2 hours a month.
Federal prison regulations were very tight on visiting in those days. And in fact, they thought of themselves as great liberals because it had been 1 hour a month back in the 40s. This was a huge reform, but one hug a month wasn't much, but the letters were surrounding me with warmth, and rereading them again as a grown-up and as a dad myself was particularly extraordinary, because I could see how with no training and with no self-help books available, he had suddenly become terrific at being a good dad from a distance. And now, reading with a dad's eye, I could see these ingenious and amazing tricks he had worked out. So he would write things like, every time I look at a sunset, I'm going to imagine you're looking at that same sunset. Or every time I see the moonrise, I'm going to think you're watching that moonrise. Or if the planets are in the sky. Or if I hear birds singing, I'm going to think you're going to be listening to bird songs. And so the distance was annihilated. And then he would write, I've been reading in the New York Times about a wonderful event that's coming up in Central Park this week, or a terrific new exhibit at the Museum of Natural History. Well, I can't go, but would you please go and be my eyes and ears? And I would go, and I would listen so much more carefully than I ever would have, and I would look so much longer and harder than I ever might have, because I was trying to do it the way Daddy would have done it. And suddenly, reading these letters, I realized, all these interests that I've had that I thought were totally my own invention, cities and landscapes, they were pouring into me through these letters. So everywhere I go, I'm carrying around part of him with me now.
After this short break, Tony Hiss explains how his father's imprisonment changed everybody.
Are you enjoying this conversation so far? And would you like to get a copy of the book we're talking about?
Just tap the link in our show notes or visit our website, heardeverything.com.
When you make a purchase through our affiliate links, you're also supporting this podcast.
And we thank you for your support.
Now back to my 1999 conversation with Tony Hiss.
You're very candid in your book about how you were affected during those 44 months, how your life was different, the accidents that you had that there didn't seem to be a ready explanation for.
It's a very odd kind of experience going through something as upside down turning as this when you're a kid. I think you tend to grow up overnight intellectually far too quickly, and you know far too much about things. And emotionally, you sort of get frozen in place. And if anything, I was the opposite of Pinocchio. I was a real boy turned into a block of wood as far as my feelings were concerned. And as you said, that the one way I seem to have of expressing myself, since I didn't want to get in anybody's way, I began to have increasingly serious accidents, getting a gash in my palm. You can still see the scar. And finally, the culminating one, tripping and falling and smashing my front teeth. I saw a series of wonderful therapists over the years who were terrifically helpful to me. And yet, oddly, the one area in which we didn't seem to make any progress was my brother. I have a half-brother who's 15 years older than I am, and the reason I never had any doubts about my dad was, growing up, my brother had always said to me, listen, I was in the house. I was 9 or 10 years old during all the times of these events. I was old enough to know what was going on. We lived in a tiny Georgetown house. Listen, Alger was not bringing home satchels full of State Department documents. Listen, Frosty, our mother, was not sitting up late retyping them. In the first place, she hated typing, and she was a lousy, rotten typist. And she took courses as an adult, and as an adult, she would write in longhand just to avoid typing. But if she had been typing, I would have heard every click of that typewriter because the walls were as thin as paper. And meanwhile, this fellow Chambers, he was not in and out of the house. It's all hooey and moonshine. So these kindly therapists would say to me, well, it would be natural. In fact, it would be healthy, Tony, if you could just admit that you must have doubts about your father. And I would go, well, that's one area that we have many disagreements. We've had bitter arguments, but not about that.
Although you do acknowledge in the book, and I think, again, very candidly and forthrightly, that maybe it would have been easier if, in fact, he had simply been guilty, and you could move on from there.
The odd thing is that psychologically, it might have been much easier if he'd been guilty, because at least then the story would have
and you'd know what to do.
It would have had an ending, because punishment balances crime, and then there's something to go on from, and he would have paid the price, and we could all get on with our lives. But an unrequited, an uncorrected wrong is a very painful event, because it cries out for help, and it's not getting any help, and it's a story that hasn't had an ending yet. And also, I must say, I think that it poses some danger to the society, because if we can be fooled that way and make that kind of mistake, until we can acknowledge that mistake, we're likely to get fooled in the same way again.
I read one review that criticized your book for not even mentioning the Venona Project. Is that missing the point of the book?
Well, it is missing the point of the book, because I was trying to write an account of this man, and not to write another book about the Hiss case. I do know about the Venona Project, and I do know that one document has surfaced which alleges that a Soviet agent codenamed Ales, A-L-E-S, was transmitting documents to the Russians during the war. Certain characteristics of this Ales, who has not been definitively identified by any means, sounded a little bit, or even somewhat more than a little bit, like what Whittaker Chambers had been saying about Alger Hiss. On the other hand, there are just as many characteristics in this cable of this so-called Ales that are entirely not like Alger Hiss, and no one's followed down that trail yet. The odd thing is that as I've begun to get to know a little bit about this, the actual amount of information that has surfaced so far is a tiny island in the middle of an enormous ocean of what's still guesswork and supposition. And there is so much information, both here in the U.S. and in Russia, that's still under lock and key, that it may well be that the scholars who are actually going to be in a position to dispassionately evaluate all the potentially available information are undergraduates now, haven't even begun their careers. They're just getting their training. In this country, there was a terrific decision two weeks ago by a federal judge saying that the grand jury transcripts in my dad's case should be released on the request of 4 national associations of historians and archivists. That's going to be 3,500 pages of testimony at least. All the closed-door hearings held by the House Committee on Un-American Activities after 1944, at this point, are not scheduled to be released until the year 2026, when I'm going to be 85. And, of course, in Russia, there was very limited access to KGB files in the early 90s. That door has slammed shut again. No one can get in. The military intelligence files no one's ever looked at, not even the Russians. There is a huge file called Stalin's personal file, which is, in fact, his office file, which maybe later this year they'll begin to have some Western funding to translate, but that will take years. And there were the files kept by Beria, the head of the secret police. There were the files kept by Molotov, the foreign minister. An amazing amount of material that no one's ever had a chance to look at.
But again, it maybe misses the point that this book is about a box full of letters that nobody in the KGB had access to.
Well, 50 years later, it really still is a case of weighing one man's word against another. So how do you find the worth of someone's word? Well, I thought that these personal letters, which Alger, of course, would have been horrified to make public because they were his private life and no one's business, spoke volumes about his character, and beautifully and eloquently. There's such lovely writing that it's the first book I've ever published that can pretend in part to be a real work of literature. And they came out in these letters and in nothing else he wrote. His public writing was much more cramped. But in some ways, maybe that's because these letters were the book he never wrote, or the book he had already written, the 500,000 letters of these words. I only sample them, and I hope that people will want to take a closer look at them. So later this year, I will be donating them to Harvard Law School Library so that people can take a look through them at their leisure. Also because they're getting brittle now. The kind of paper the government gave to inmates to write on.
I'm sure it wasn't A1 quality.
No, it was not bonded stuff. And I'd hoped originally to save them for my son, but I think they're better off in the hands of good conservators like the folks at the Harvard Law School Library.
Alger Hiss died in 1996. He was 92 years old. Now you can get your copy of The View from Alger's Window by Tony Hiss by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. HeardEverything.com is where you can also hear my 1990 interview with someone else caught up in the Red Scare of the early 50s, Howard Fast.
In the 1930s, the Communist Party of the United States was honored to a point almost of reverence. There was almost no person of talent in the United States who was not connected with it in one way or another.
And my 1991 conversation with a man whose father was famous in a very different way, the son of actor Yul Brynner, Rock Brynner.
When I grew up, I was assured by everyone I knew, from school to everywhere I went, that my father was the king. People wanted him to be the king.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you find podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, he was one of the early executives at America Online. Remember AOL? He's also the owner of the Washington Capitals, the Washington Wizards, and the Washington Mystics. My 2010 conversation with Ted Leonsis.
The happier the company, the more successful it will be. The more you have happy employees and happy customers, the more financially solvent that you'll be. And in this time of great stress, it's the happy companies that are winning.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.